Okay, the suspense is killing me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Colleen Murphy, and I'm the Associate University Librarian for Teaching, Learning, and Research here at the University of Regina, Dr. John Archer Library and Archives. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 lands with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the territories of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the homeland of the Métis Michif Nation. Today, these lands continue to be the shared territory of many diverse peoples from near and far. So we have a few housekeeping notes. As you must have noted, all attendees are muted during the event, and there will be a Q&A session at about 7:45, where people will be able to post questions in the chat. Also, you will have noticed that we are being recorded. The recording will be uploaded to the university's YouTube channel, and Michael will be putting that link in the chat. The Archer Library and Archives and University Advancement and Communications are excited tonight to present Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire, a virtual book talk with David Plummer on Bell Let's Day. Today is a special day in Canada dedicated to raising awareness and combating stigma surrounding mental health and the challenges people face with it. Tonight, you can expect to learn something you may not have known as Dave shares insights from his newly released book titled Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire, Everything I Know About Autism, ASD, and Asperger's that I wished I'd known back then. Our host and moderator for the evening is Joelle Seal. Joelle is an associate producer in current affairs at CBC Saskatchewan and director for the Morning Edition radio program. She is also a sessional lecturer here for advanced broadcasting at the University of Regina School of Journalism. She holds a Master of Journalism from the U of R, as well as a Bachelor of Arts degree in history from the University of Regina. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Joelle.
Thank you for that, Colleen. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us here tonight. I will be introducing Dave and then talking to him a bit for an interview and then followed by your questions. So he went from computer science classrooms at the University of Regina all the way to barbecues in Bill Gates's backyard. Dave Plummer was born and raised in Regina, but he now lives in Seattle, Washington. He is a University of Regina alumnus. He's an entrepreneur, retired software programmer, and former employee at Microsoft. You may also be familiar with some of his work from the times you found yourself wrestling with an uncooperative Windows PC, pressing Control-Alt-Delete. Dave created the one and only Windows Task Manager. About 3 years ago, Dave was diagnosed with autism, and now he's sharing his secrets to a successful life for people with autism and those who love them. Please welcome Dave Plummer with a reading from his 2021 book published called Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire, Everything I Knew About Autism, ASD, and Asperger's that I'd wish I'd known back then. Dave?
Thank you. I'd like to thank Luann, Michael, Joelle, Colleen, and everyone else involved for hosting me today, as well as to thank you for taking time out of your day for a virtual reading on a book on a somewhat uncommon topic. And right off the top, I want to apologize for the title of my book. I die a little bit inside every time I think about the title, as it's a pure piece of clickbait. Secrets of the Autistic Millionaire. Like we're going to be counting cards or predicting what day of the week you were born on for fun and profit. Well, I'm sorry to disappoint, but about the only impressive autistic skill I might possess would be remembering my U of R student number, 189-704-573. And relax, I Googled it first to make sure nothing spooky came up, but I remember my Canadian social insurance number, my American social security number, my Washington state driver's license, and all of my credit card numbers. I know most of the important phone numbers from my youth, back when those things still mattered. I know that when I went to the U of R, I parked in what was then Lot 13 out by the power plant, and my license plate at the time was MWM460. And yet I'm not especially good with numbers or math. It may or may not surprise you then to learn that I'm hopeless when it comes to remembering the little chores and things that my wife will ask me to do. To borrow a phrase from computer science, my memory is completely event-driven and not interrupt-driven. If I'm working my way through a complicated process, I'll remember every important detail in precise fashion. But if I must remember to feed the dogs at noon, well, that's much more of a hit and miss situation. The good thing is that most dogs and toddlers will tell you when their snack is seriously overdue. But with that out of the way, let me start at the beginning on page 1. The first time I met Bill was almost 30 years ago in his backyard. A pair of burly security guards dressed in too tight Microsoft polo shirts politely escorted me through his home on the west side of Lake Washington. It was a mansion to my Midwestern eyes, though only a fraction the size of the more famous home he would later build sprawling across the hillsides of the lake's eastern shore. Windows 95 was still in the future, and I was at Microsoft working on the older operating system known as MS-DOS. I was just a temporary intern, not even a full-time blue badge employee yet, but back in those days, Microsoft was small enough to allow Bill to invite the top college prospects over for a backyard barbecue. Out on the lawn with a microbrew in hand, we all clustered around him, hoping to catch his interest in conversation. Each of us had no doubt prepared something clever to say, just in case the opportunity presented itself. Perhaps an insight about or a criticism of a Microsoft product so perceptive or biting that he'd recognize our innate genius amongst the crowd and pluck us like a gem from the front lines. That was the daydream. The starker reality was that after our burger and beer, we'd be hurried out the front door and back to headquarters in Redmond to work another of our 16-hour days, competing directly against one another for the top spots. Everyone came from the best schools, MIT and Princeton in the United States and Waterloo in Canada. With over 100,000 job applications coming into Microsoft every year at the time, just being one of those 30 was an incredibly big deal, especially if you were from the University of Regina like I was. That's in Saskatchewan, if that helps any. But either way, I was only really at Microsoft by virtue of having put myself through college on the proceeds from writing software for a competing computer platform. My program, HyperCache, had already sold a few thousand copies before it popped up on Microsoft's radar. My task now was to write something like it for their MS-DOS, releasing it for 100 million PCs instead of just a few thousand. If that went well, there was a good chance of a full-time spot upon graduation, complete with their famously lucrative Microsoft stock options. Failing that, I could always go back to my old job at 7-Eleven, and so you can imagine why I wanted to make a good first impression. We gathered in concentric circles around Bill as the setting sun glistened off the lake behind us. Few dared probe toward the center where Bill himself stood alone, but I had an advantage with Ben, my manager. He knew Bill and seemed completely unfazed by fame or fortune. Ben pulled me straight through the gauntlet of would-be nerds and presented me directly to Bill as if I were a prized protege. He told him, "This is Dave, our intern from Canada," in the space of 4 months, and his voice trailed off to list the very real technical accomplishments that I had worked so hard to complete that summer. I listened in earnestness at first, but soon became highly distracted with one very real problem. It hadn't technically been 4 months, as Ben had said. It had only taken 3 months, not 4. It was a small thing, but an important detail. I was sure they'd want to know. I cleared my throat, spoke up, and interrupted them with the correction. 3 months. Surprised, they both stopped, turned, and looked at me. My heart sank. Once again, as always, I had spoken out of turn, somehow saying just the wrong thing at precisely the wrong time. That much was obvious, and that was 3 decades ago. And yet, I just found out last week that I have autism. Now, I wrote this part raw in the aftermath of that diagnosis to capture my early thoughts about it. Ben and I had both both long since moved on from Microsoft, and I had not seen him in several years. At some point along the way, he had been surprised by a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder for his own adult daughter. And apparently, after better understanding the symptoms and seeing them in the context of his own family, one of his early thoughts was, Dave should get himself tested. Soon after, he took me for lunch and told me about his daughter's diagnosis, and without really being specific as to why, he encouraged me to investigate being tested for autism myself. I wasn't really bothered by the idea, but I was a bit confused as to what would lead him to think so. I went home and I took the autism spectrum quotient test online, and of a possible 50 points, I scored 40. Clearly, I thought I must be answering the questions with personal bias, so I had my wife of 25 years sit down and make sure I was being accurate and honest. I took the test with her to make sure I did not exaggerate. My score went up, 42. For years, I had joked, I'm not on the spectrum, but you can see it from here. I later upgraded that to, I might be on the spectrum, but I'm on the non-visible portion. Still, I didn't really consider it possible. I'm empathetic, sensitive, emotional, and funny, all things that I thought would preclude me from being anywhere on the autism spectrum. I booked the necessary appointments and over the course of a few weeks completed all the testing. I would have done better on the SAT and math sections with a little advanced practice, but going in cold as an adult was also interesting in its own right. It sure had been a long time since I'd done much long division. Preparing the full report took a few weeks, and my wife accompanied me to receive the results. The good news? Well, apparently I'm reasonably clever, as in 3 standard deviations smart. On some portions of the cognitive testing, I even achieved perfection, something never seen before. But I was also slow. I got the right answer, but I took my own sweet time to get it. Each test runs to completion without you knowing the time limit, but they watch and record where you were at when the set time limit expired. I scored an equivalent of 1550 out of 1600 on the SAT, but only if time wasn't considered. Had I been cut off at the official time limit, I would have only scored 1150, a fairly average score. The reason? Well, apparently I have a serious attention deficit disorder. Oh, and as noted, it also turns out that I have autism. More accurately, I was officially diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. As the doctor, my wife and I flipped through the pages of the report in unison, terms like significant social dysfunction stared back at me. When we finally got to the autism-specific behavior section, my wife was pleased to note, well, at least the numbers here are good, far above average. But then the doctor corrected her. Oh, no, higher is worse. I used to be gifted, but now I had a diagnosis, and it had a better and a worse, and that's about all I felt in those initial minutes. Not everyone appreciates popular media portrayals of autism, but we'll leave that aside for now to make use of 2 such examples as handy measuring devices. If I were forced to use pop references as perhaps the least accurate but most communicative way to express the amount of autism that I am affected by, I would say I have 80% as much as Sheldon Cooper on The Big Bang Theory. At current exchange rates, I estimate that makes me about 25% as autistic as the title character in the movie Rain Man. As you can guess, these are not professional metrics. They're numbers pulled from the air by a layman. When I told my closest and most curmudgeonly 70-year-old combat veteran mechanic friend that testing had revealed me to be a little autistic, his flat reply was, "Just a little, huh?" So apparently, not everybody was surprised. We will discuss the possibility of being a little autistic in later chapters. From the actual test report, I can see that I'm more autistic than about 98.5% of the general population. While that might sound quite autistic, I'm still fairly high functioning. I don't use those terms a lot, however. I'm also highly impacted in many ways, which is what makes my balance point interesting, I believe. In short, I'm far enough into it to deeply understand the autism thought process that is normally inaccessible to neurotypical people, yet still conversant enough to explain it back to everyone what they're missing, and even how this condition can be of use in their own lives at times. Hopefully, I can explain it to you. Unfortunately, as with many people on the spectrum, my brain is complicated in other ways as well. As noted earlier, I have significant attention deficit disorder. My mother says she would add hyperactivity to the list, but I was never tested as a youth. I also, to my great regret, smoked cigarettes for 30 years, and I believe that it was a stimulant that allowed me to manage my dopamine and stay focused for most of my adult life. This probably explains why the ADD only really came to light when I quit smoking, or while sitting without them for long exams or depositions and so on. On top of this, I've also suffered from anxiety, which has been known to lead to bouts of depression if not well managed. Or could it be that these are just aspects of my autism, mischaracterized as unrelated anxiety and mood disorders for decades? These were among the questions I would attempt to answer for myself. Learning these things about myself didn't happen all at once. In fact, it's been a process of discovery over the course of more than 25 years, treating problems and issues whenever and wherever they arose without systematically looking for a deeper connection between them. That I did not eventually diagnose my own autism surprises me. I don't feel bad for missing it, however, given that for decades, more qualified educators and professionals also overlooked the same symptoms. To be honest, however, I can't blame them either. Over the years, I've become a master at masking, or the art of acting normal, which makes a diagnosis without specific testing even more difficult. Girls are reportedly even better at such masking, going undiagnosed even more often as a result. The good news is that this odd mix of brain disorder and ability has not caused my life to descend entirely into chaos. In fact, quite the contrary. Although there's been a wild ride at times for both myself and those around me, this exotic brain of mine has served me incredibly well. If you will briefly indulge some self-congratulatory details, I graduated at the top of my university with a computer science degree, though years late in starting because I dropped out of high school. I've made multiple fortunes many different ways. I have designed, invented, and engineered products used daily by billions of humans around the globe. Been issued half a dozen patents, started my own company in my den that went on to achieve over $100 million in sales, married my beautiful soulmate, raised 4 happy and successful children, and much more. And yet, for all this self-indulgent list of success, privilege, and grace, I still struggle with simple things like eye contact and conversation flow and relationships and anger and anxiety and meltdowns and a dozen other things that we shall soon turn to look at. It is only now, in retrospect, that I can look back and see specifically where aspects of autism impacted my life, for better or for worse. And it is here that I tell those stories. If I am successful, it will be because I not only explain and entertain, but I will have done so in a way that empowers you to apply some of these lessons learned to your own life, whether you are personally affected by autism or not. Because to be clear, life with some autism can be spectacular. Within these pages, I have 4 related goals. The first is to give you a better understanding of high-functioning individuals with autism, the real Sheldon Coopers of the world, if you will. I want you to understand what makes us tick, what we think, why we think it, how we act upon it, and why we do it that way. From there, the book will take an in-depth look at some important autism topics, often from multiple perspectives. For example, the chapter on employment considers both what it means to be managed by an autistic manager, as well as what it takes to manage an autistic employee. The vantage point will continue to shift as we tackle topics such as parenting and marriage. The second goal is to help you understand specifically what makes those with autism so relentless in their pursuit of success. After identifying and discussing those traits and attributes, my goal is to help those with similar traits capitalize on them. Perhaps if a neurotypical person reading this can understand the characteristics, routines, and habits of certain individuals with autism, they too will be able to increase their odds of success through learning new approaches for their own lives. There's no easy way to know if public figures such as Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Mark Zuckerberg are on the autism spectrum. If they are, none have publicly shared that information, and unless and until they do, it's a private health matter that I won't speculate on. We can, however, observe and identify certain traits and characteristics that they exhibit in common with people on the spectrum, and note how they may have served to make those individuals so driven to succeed in their own endeavors, regardless of whether they experience the disorder or not, which is almost the point. Irrespective of who is officially diagnosed with what condition, if something worked for me and it worked for them, it might work for you. A third goal is to entertain you along the way, as it has been quite an interesting journey. Not just for me, but for the loved ones around me who must have felt sometimes as untethered as I did. The tales of how autism has impacted my life and career are not here merely through the vicarious enjoyment of others. I truly believe that for somebody with the disorder, and for those close to that person, both knowing how I persevered and seeing where I stumbled and failed can be useful and instructive. The fourth and final goal is to help assure loved ones, especially any parents of children newly diagnosed with autism, at least those at a level of severity like my own, having a diagnosis in hand can make things much easier to manage. In truth, this perceived responsibility I feel towards parents of such children remains my primary motivation in coming out about my autism. If I had known in my youth what I know now, my life would have been even better, or at least a much easier journey. Knowing that in just a few chapters I could tell you things that took me and my family a lifetime to learn by trial and error was a driving factor in me completing this book. In this way, I hope to possibly save you a great deal of angst and misery. If you come along on this journey, you'll watch as I go from being a bullied youth to winding up a high school dropout, and then turn my life around sharply enough to return to school and ultimately secure distinguished research grants and scholarships. Next, we'll leave the small farming city in Saskatchewan for Microsoft at the height of the 1990s tech boom as I get married, graduate, and emigrate all in one crazy weekend. Follow as I build a company, starting in my den, whose sales explode geometrically, causing me to sell it to a nut for cash to a NASDAQ company. Right at the peak, I will be sued by the government, federally compliance audited, and state tax audited all at once during the sale, potentially scuttling the entire deal and prompting an autistic meltdown right in the offices of the Attorney General. Moving on from my personal experience with autism, we will look at selected topics related to the disorder. Because autism is probably still new for most of us, we can follow the standard model of instruction. Here's what I tried, here's what worked, and what did not, and why I think that is. We will follow that approach for important topics related to autism, such as empathy, emotions, masking, mind blindness, marriage, parenting, employment, and many more. By the end of this book, you will know a great deal more about what it's like to live with autism, and for those that were already keenly aware, you will learn a few secrets for staying sane and being successful. The things I've discovered along the way. Finally, we shall turn to some more speculative topics. As we unwind the complex attributes, characteristics, methods, and mannerisms of those with autism, I believe there is much to be learned by the neurotypical as well. What causes the obsessive drive towards success in some people with autism? And if this is identifiable, can it be emulated? Are medical students cramming for board exams really faking autism selectively for brief periods? Can someone be really a little bit autistic? Should people with autism fake it to make friends, and where should the limits of such masking end? Are some movies and television shows with autistic characters as exploitive as some would assert? We will consider all these issues and more. I'm going to pause there so that we can proceed on to the interview and Q&A sections of the program. Thanks for listening so far.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. So what made you want to share your secrets?
I think it was really a desire to avoid, well, not to avoid, but it would have been nice if I had known many of the things much younger. And so if I can give that information to somebody just kind of getting started out in life, short circuits a lot of the learning by trial and error.
How has having this diagnosis changed things for you now that you have it?
I think it normalized a lot of things for me. I knew that I was very different, and I knew that I was different in a number of different ways. What I found out is that there were a lot of people that are similarly different in the same ways. And so a lot of things about autism, like masking or mimicking, and things that I thought were kind of unique to me turn out to be common attributes among them. And so it made a lot of things feel a lot more normal.
Looking back on your career, what do you think could have been different had you known back then?
I think it really had the biggest impact when I got into management, because the mind blindness that comes with autism requires that I project and assume what people are thinking. And the easiest assumption is they are thinking what I would be thinking in their situation. And so I also assume they would like to be managed like I would be managed, or led or encouraged in the way that I would like to be. And it took a long time for me to figure out that there are, wildly different personality types, and the type of affirmation and encouragement that somebody needs is different from individual to individual. So that's not an ASD specific thing, but the problem I think arose with always trying to project yourself onto the other person as a proxy or a substitute for the other person led me to make that mistake.
And that led you to making that mistake when you were working as a manager with Microsoft? Yeah. How did you see that happen as a manager?
Yeah. Oh, pardon me?
How did you see that happen when you were working as a manager?
I think the biggest thing was that there were certain employees that needed more constant reassurance than I did. And so I wasn't giving them enough. Whereas there was other people that really wanted other things, whether it was money or promotion or visibility or whatever, and I was giving them types of affirmation that I would want, and it's not what they wanted. The book Love Languages, it's kind of like that, in the sense that you've got to figure out what that individual employee wants. And I have no way to predict what that is. So I don't have a good enough sense from just sitting with an individual and communicating with them, because I lack certain abilities to communicate due to autism, that I got to make it up as I go along. And if I make it up too much, I get it wrong.
You also talked about how it would have changed your childhood. How do you think it would have changed your childhood had you had this diagnosis when you were young?
I don't know in my childhood that it would have materially made much difference, because things were a lot different. It was very new. I mean, Asperger's wasn't even named until '94, I think. So I don't know that it would have, but for a kid now, I think at my level of functioning or my level of impairment, I think I would rather find out kind of about 3 to 5 years out of college, because you don't want to be labeled early if you don't have to. You don't want to use it as a crutch. But once you get to the point where you're kind of caught up with life, maybe it helps at that point to go forward and grow more from that point, I think. In terms of kids today, though, I think an early diagnosis is really important, because they have so many early interventions that they can do, and social training is hugely important, and there's all kinds of things that you can do for younger kids now that they didn't do when I was a kid. So
you talked about a few characteristics that you have that you felt precluded you from this diagnosis. What have you learned about autism spectrum disorder since that has changed that perspective?
I had I don't want to say an odd version of autism, but I tried to understand what autism was before, and people explained it to me. It's like, well, they don't see other people as fully human, and these weird things that you would hear described, and I never understood it, or that they lacked emotion or empathy. And once I found out, well, no, I don't lack those things, yet I am autistic, there has to be some problem with that description. And I think what it turns out is that people with autism experience the full range of emotions, and they have incredible empathy like anybody else would, but there's a communication boundary between them and neurotypical people, so that if somebody else is feeling something that should be obvious, I don't get it. And I've sat in meetings where I've had a third person present, and I've had to stop and say, I know you guys think I know what you're talking about, but I really don't. And you guys got to stop and explain it to me because I'm lost. Because they're doing some neurotypical magical exchange of information through body language and posture and all these other ways of doing it that I'm kind of oblivious to.
But you've still managed to have a successful marriage and a family. How has your family accommodated your needs in this way?
More and more so as we found out what was going on. I think one example is Disneyland, where we'd go to Disneyland and I would try to spend an 8-hour day at Disneyland with my kids. And I found it incredibly challenging. And I mean, I love my kids, I like Disneyland, but after about 4 hours of it with millions of people, I just need to be away. And I would say I didn't know what was wrong because I didn't know I was autistic and I didn't know that I had problems with groups and people and stuff like that. And I would just say, I need a break or I need a rest. And they would look for a bench for me to sit on. But the problem was I wasn't tired. I needed to be away from the commitment of having to mask and having to act and having to perform and act like a Disneyland patron and all those things. I'd rather just kind of sit in my room for 30 minutes with a flat affect and play with my laptop or do something to get away. And so what we wound up doing was staying right at Disneyland eventually. Is that me? Somebody go alone?
I'm not sure what it was. Sorry. You talked about masking a little bit there. What can you tell us about, what are some of the ways that you mask? And did you do this before you even knew what you were doing?
I did. I didn't know what it was. I have a real habit of imitating people. So if I have a friend with an accent and I'm sitting with them, within about 20 minutes, I'll start to pick up their accent, and I need to be careful not to do that. Or even as a kid, I would read a comic book and I would emulate characters from the book, or I would watch a television show and I would emulate characters from the show. And sometimes my mother would have to intervene and say, yeah, no, Archie is, a smart ass to his mother or to Mr. Weatherby, but that's not cool. And, kids try on new behaviors, but I always had to search for behaviors to emulate. And masking is really normal. And I think if you hang out in neurotypical social groups, you start to just emulate the people that are around you, and eventually you will get more and more accustomed to their customs and the way they operate and behave. But it takes a while. So it's one of those things that can be learned, but does not come as a natural ability, I think.
You also talk about stimming in your book as well. What is stimming for those who don't know?
That is a repetitive action or even a tick or a verbalization that you do repeatedly because it provides some comfort. So a very basic example is if you have ADD, you can sit there and bounce your knee. And that is an example of a stim because what it does is it gives you an ability to focus on something and distract you and prevent other distractions from interrupting you. And that's how it's understood anyway, but that behavior is very common with people on the spectrum. And so in my case, I tend to snap my fingers as I walk down the hallway, so I have to watch myself that I'm not doing that because it can be annoying. And I've seen very other common behaviors like walking down a hallway. People with ASD will often grab the hallway wall and walk with their fingertips on the wall as they go down the hallway. And I was wondering about that, and I don't know exactly what it is, but I think it's a way of providing a constant, predictable stimulation as you're going down this hallway of randomness that gives you all these random stimulations that you're not ready for. It's kind of a grounding, I think. It's the best I can explain it anyway.
You've also kind of adapted that snapping thing. What can you tell me about that?
Oh yeah, so if I have to do it, if there's people around and I'm walking around and I can feel it, I will tap rather than snapping. So I'm still kind of going through the motion and I get the physical and the autonomic feedback without disturbing others. So
how did you come to find that solution? Was it that someone raised it with you? What happened to, or
no,
what was
I had
the
a buddy at
situation?
Microsoft that was an engineer that I admired greatly, but he's also on the spectrum, and I noticed, man, that dude snaps his fingers a lot. That's pretty annoying. And so I noticed it in somebody else, and I just decided, oh, I guess I do that too now that I think about it. So,
what was take me back to, I know your reading was from those first few moments when you got your diagnosis. Can you remember your initial reaction?
yeah, I was surprised to hear, eventually I felt it was a real normalizing thing, but in the first couple of minutes or even hour of the diagnosis, I felt like they were really pathologizing me in the sense that, oh, wow, all these things I do are in a book in the bad column. And that kind of felt weird, I think.
And how did you change? You said that you feel differently about it now. How did that change?
I think a lot of the things I was looking at were characteristics that they use to identify people with autism, and it's not the full picture because there are benefits to autism, I believe, and they're not something they test for pathologically in a doctor's office. It just happens to come with it. So when you're initially learning, you're only learning all of the bad things about it, and then as you experience and learn more about it, I think that you get a better, broader perspective on it.
What can all neurotypical people learn from people with autism? As you just mentioned, there's some skills and things that can be learned from it.
Right. Perseverance is a big one. Steve Jobs has a quote that what separates successful entrepreneurs from non-successful ones is generally almost entirely perseverance. And people that are on the spectrum as entrepreneurs tend to have incredible perseverance in pursuing their one idea. So they have singular focus on one problem, and sometimes to their own detriment. But if they've selected the right problem to solve, it can make them formidable competitors, really.
Can you think of a recent problem that you've solved, that you've persevered to solve recently?
There have been a couple software issues and a hardware issue. I was restoring an old Commodore hard drive, and it's not a sufficiently fascinating story to go through, but it took me about a month to get it right. But it was something I was really ready to give up on, but I just kind of feel like I can't give up on it. It's like it nags at me, and I'll leave it alone for a couple days, and it'll start to come and haunt me again. You know, you left that thing, and what's wrong with it? I don't know. Well, why don't you know? Well, I don't know, but there's always this drive to know. And it's hard to not know things sometimes.
You talk about mind blindness in the book too. What can you tell me about that?
That is not knowing what other people are thinking and always having to, for me, sort of cognitively guess what they're thinking. Whereas I think people that are neurotypical have sort of a sixth sense. They can sit with a person over a cup of coffee, and there's all these other out-of-band communication mechanisms beyond what they're just saying. So if you're just texting with somebody, it feels very limiting compared to if you're in person. But for somebody with ASD, there's two aspects. First, it's very hard to get that communication. It's kind of like for a normal person or a neurotypical person to deal with a Secret Service agent is my nearest analogy, because they have the shades on. You can't tell what emotion if they were crying or very upset, you could tell. And I can tell as well. But when it's a subtle information, if a Secret Service agent is feeling a little jealous or maybe a little suspicious, through the shades, it's hard to tell. And that's kind of the level I receive it at, too. I don't know if that answers your question. I think I got off on a tangent there. But
yeah, I was going to ask, how does that work out in your marriage?
My wife is very expressive, and she is as far from ASD as possible. So I think people with ASD, and I don't want to generalize too much, but it seems very common that they tend to have a checklist of things that they know they're no good at, and they go and find people that are great at those things. And I don't know if it's a compensation mechanism or what, but my wife has great central coherence and planning and all these things that I'm terrible at, and she's social, and I'm good at things that she's not good at. So it's a real good partnership in that sense.
So what do you wish you knew about autism before you were diagnosed?
What do I wish I knew? One is that the spectrum is really broad, because it used to be there was Asperger's, and there was pervasive developmental disorder and childhood destructive disorder and all these different things, and now they're all unified under autism. And at first, a lot of people find that weird. The more I learned about it, it's this common set of characteristics and attributes, so it really does apply to everybody, but in varying degrees. And what that means is that the autism spectrum itself is huge in terms of neurodiversity. People on it aren't all the same. And you can't assume that every introverted computer scientist is on the spectrum, and not everybody that's on the spectrum is a savant, and people are just wildly different. So a lot of the assumptions you might make turn out to not to be true.
What advice would you have for people with autism navigating the workforce?
I have a section in the book called Making Friends with Autism, and it's almost a little pedantic in that I refer a lot to an old Dale Carnegie book for some real simple basics, like allow other people to do the majority of the talking. Don't just talk about the subject that you're fascinated with. let them speak at least 60% of the time. And there's cadence and rules to eye contact and all kinds of things that if you do none of it, you're going to stand out and you're going to have difficulty getting along. And the problem is that it's different than a family or a marriage or a relationship because your coworkers are kind of forced to be there with you. So if you're not getting along with them, it can be not a great situation. So it's kind of a go along to get along thing, but I think a certain amount of training and integration helps. So
What advice would you have for someone managing a person who has autism?
Try to figure out what their priorities are because mine were very different. I didn't really want to be advanced, but I wanted to have impact. So I wanted to go to meetings, you know, the important meetings, but not because I wanted to be seen in the meetings, because I wanted to be able to affect the outcome of the meetings. And so I don't think I was very good as an autistic employee in explaining what was important to me, what would drive me, and so on. And I think they assumed that neurotypical things would, and that's what they did. So again, it's kind of the disconnect between the priorities of neurotypical versus autistic people are sometimes different.
Since your diagnosis, you've taken on some things that make you uncomfortable, like YouTubing and writing books as a challenge to yourself. What
Right.
makes you want to do these things that scare you?
Initially, I was afraid of being bracketed by the diagnosis. This is what you can do, and these are the type of things you like. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's true, but that's because I want to be that way. And so eventually I had to do some of the things that I didn't want to do to prove to myself that I had the ability to do things outside. And so one of those was I had a big open house shop party at my shop for like 100 people. And I wrote this book, and I worked on that for, a long time. And I started the YouTube channel, which is, of course, very humbling because you've got to edit yourself in 4K 60 all the time. But I found it actually pretty helpful for improving and tweaking my masking, I think, because it allows me to, as I'm expressing something, I will think I'm expressive, but it comes across as this really flat affect that's hard to read. And I'll catch myself doing that, and I'll realize, well, in that moment, I was experiencing an emotion, but you have no way to know from my face. So you kind of learn that, I think, from watching yourself. So it's been helpful in that sense.
You have a good anecdote in the book about a gentleman that you felt that you may have had this flat affect after he did a great job for you. I believe it was on a car, correct?
Yeah.
Was it? Yes. What can you tell me about that?
I had a car restored, and it was a multi-year project. They had a couple thousand hours of labor in there over the course of a couple of years. And so at the very end, I had to fly out and inspect the car, which I did. And so I went around, and all the craftsmen are standing around, waiting for my review, basically. And I went around, and I'm like, well, this is very well done. I'm impressed with that. And I was very calm, but, a lot of people, when they reveal a restored car, are like on those TV shows, the extreme makeover. They lose their mind, they jump up and down. People with ASD generally don't do that. They'll more calmly approach the situation. And so I was just walking around and making all these observations, and I did compliment and everything else, but I wasn't exuberant. I wasn't praising their work. I didn't puff them up, and then I went home. And I never thought of it again because I didn't know I had autism. That's just the way I am. And then I thought of this probably 5-10 years later, because I tend to go back and revisit past interactions and critique how I did them. And I realized it, and so I emailed the manager of the shop, this is many years later, and I said, when I picked up my car many years ago, I worried that perhaps I gave the wrong impression. I explained. And I got an email back like 5 minutes later, and he's like, yes, I've thought of this incident many, many times in my life. And so it really resonated with him, too. So I was so glad that I reached out to him, and we had a great dialogue back and forth, and he felt way better about the restoration work, and I felt better that he understood me, and it was... But had I not gone back and revisited that, because I then later found out that I had autism, then that opportunity would have been lost.
So how does it feel to take on these challenges that make you uncomfortable?
Initially, it's always uncomfortable. I guess that's, obvious. But it's one of those things that the most growth occurs in uncharted waters, that kind of thing, where you really find that you get the most reward for doing it, I think. So sometimes you really got to press yourself to do things you don't want because they're new and different for you. But if you get through it, the reward is much greater than doing the same thing over and over again.
What do you hope that people take away from your book?
First and foremost, that the range of, as I said, the neurodiversity within the spectrum is huge, so you can't make too many assumptions about anybody on the spectrum. The other is that autism is not all doom and gloom. There are certainly cases that it's so severe that it is, but in other cases, because the spectrum is so broad, life with some autism can be great. And that's something I've been trying to communicate through the book, in that there are optimistic ways to look at it. I find that if you go online and you go into like an Asperger's group on Facebook, it's a kind of a dark place. They're not a happy group, a set of people, and I'm not sure entirely why that is, but it was something I wanted to run counter to in my book, I guess. So I tried to bring a sense of optimism and outlook to it.
Yeah, and you hoped that that optimism and hope would help parents navigating a child diagnosis with autism. How would you see this diagnosis helping a child early on?
And to be clear, I've never had a kid on the spectrum that I know of, so I really can't speak too much to parenting kids on the spectrum, but I would hope that, first of all, getting a diagnosis, as I said earlier, allows you so many early interventions, but I think it also allows you to sort of capitalize on the kid's strengths, and if the kid really, really loves trains or dinosaurs, then entertain that. And you have to modulate that. It can't be the only thing they do, but you can certainly indulge their passion, because it's real and it's genuine if they're feeling it. So,
do you felt like you were able to indulge your passions growing up?
Sometimes I had the occasional teacher that would, figure out that I wasn't getting enough from the regular class, and I would do special reports on the space program, and I'd list all the American and Soviet launches in the back in tables that I'm sure she didn't look at, but it was awesome to me to be able to go through the exercise and have somebody care and pay attention. So.
You also talk about a 10-second autism test in your book and on your YouTube channel. What can you tell me about that?
There's a theory that ASD may be an overrepresentation of technical genes, that you get maybe fewer social genes, or those genes, the same neurons are then dedicated to a different type of processing instead of mere neurons. And so that somebody with ASD generally has, and these are of course wild generalizations, I'm breaking populations down into two buckets, so it really has to be, but people that have ASD have a slightly different perspective on life. And so if you ask the question, what is the most important thing to society? Is it cooperation or is it creativity? And you let people consider their answer. Generally, people that are on the spectrum will say creativity, whereas people that are not on the spectrum will say cooperation. And that's where they see the most power. And I think to make a good example out of, if you look at Edison versus Tesla, I would say that Tesla worked alone. He was probably on the spectrum. His best friend was a pigeon. All kinds of stuff that, not the pigeon stuff, but I mean the fact that he worked isolated without a lot of social interaction is, I guess, my point. Whereas Edison worked in a lab with hundreds of people. And so for Edison to be successful, he needed cooperation and collaboration with a large lab of people, whereas Tesla just wanted to be alone by himself with his notebook and do his thing. Both worked, obviously, and they're completely different approaches. So sometimes having people with different tool sets that they bring to the table is great, because you can solve problems that you couldn't with just one set of tools.
Now, you said that the title is a bit clickbaity.
Yeah.
There's also chicken nuggets on the cover. In case anyone sees your book, they'll see the chicken nuggets and they'll know that's your book. Why are chicken nuggets on the cover?
I don't want to give it away entirely, but I have found, and I had them for lunch, by the way, McDonald's chicken nuggets. They're awesome. People on the spectrum tend to like their food predictable with consistent texture, and it's not that chicken nuggets are the best possible food, but they fit that bill nicely for kids. So if you were a successful person with autism, what would you have? You would have a whole lot of perfect chicken nuggets, and I guess that's kind of the origin of the cover, but there's more to it than that. I'll leave it up to people's imagination.
Yeah, they'll have to read it to find out. Well, now I'm going to turn it over to the chat for people's questions. Sorry, you get a little feedback. Dave.
Is that me?
Yeah. I think so. I think we're good now.
Okay.
Oh, maybe not. Maybe not. Hang on a second. All right, so we have someone in the chat who wants to learn a little bit more about your childhood experiences with family, teachers, and classmates.
I I gravitated initially to another. Oh, let me hear the question. Or was that the question?
Yes, that was the question, but someone, can we have whoever else's mic is on muted? Okay, I think we got it here. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, never mind.
What the hell? Hello?
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you, Wayne.
Oh, okay. There's a lot of echo here. I'm not sure why. Can you hear me
Do you-
now?
Yes, but we're doing questions in the chat. If you don't mind sending your question.
Say again?
Can you put your question, are you able to put your question in the chat?
Well, I tried to, but I couldn't get it to type. I
Okay,
want
go
to know
ahead
if
then.
Dave Plummer is a student of mine from Luther College.
Luther. No, I never went to Luther College.
Well, then you're a different Plummer than I thought, but the years matched up and I thought you must be one of my top debaters from Luther College in Regina about the time that you were going to high school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, interesting. But that doesn't matter. I'm going to read your book anyway.
Well, thank you very much.
Oh, it's very, very interesting to me. Yeah, thank you. Okay,
Well, thank
great.
you.
Glad I know that.
Thank you, Wayne. Yes, and we have another person in the chat who wants to learn a little bit more about childhood experiences with family, teachers, and classmates.
Okay. Yeah, I think I initially gravitated towards one or two other kids that were, I don't know if they were on the spectrum, but they were a lot like me as kids. And I think people on the spectrum tend to make a few really strong friendships as opposed to having 30 different friends. You'll wind up with one or two really close friends. And often there are people that are not on the spectrum. So it's, it's Spock and Kirk as opposed to Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid, I guess. It's a different relationship. So not to go on a tangent, but I think the representation of that relationship on Star Trek is actually a pretty good example of a ASD and a neurotypical friendship. So I think they did a good job in writing that. I don't know if it was intentional that way or not, but that's my speculation. So.
And Michelle asks, Dave, do you consider yourself gifted? You are the most talented person I know.
Oh, well, thank you. In certain dimensions, yeah, I'm gifted in certain dimensions, I'm sure. And I have deficits in other dimensions. I'd like to believe it all averages out, but I don't know because you don't know how everything is weighted. So I'm happy to get the gifts that I have got and put up with the deficits that I've got. I'm pleased with my mix. So.
So Dave,
Yep. Who's that?
Wayne here again.
Hi there, Wayne.
Just want you to know that you grew up in Rocanville and I grew up in Tantallon, not very far away.
Oh, my dad's from Rocanville. Yeah.
Yeah, cute.
Yeah, he spoke of
Was your dad-
Tantallon a lot.
Was your dad or who was Ernie Plummer?
That's my grandfather.
I thought so. Okay.
There you
Cheers,
go.
buddy. Okay,
Thank you.
great story.
Rima asks, how does autism anyhow affect focus overall? Does your autism affect focus overall?
I believe so. There's a high correlation between ADD and ASD. So it doesn't mean that you'll necessarily have one if you have the other, of course, but since they're correlated and I have both, I find that there is both hyperfocus and then a lack of focus. So I will get deeply focused on something and be almost impossible to interrupt, or people will come and talk to me and I'll be like, yeah, where I'm not paying any attention except what I'm still working on. That could be a powerful effect. And the other one is the lack of focus, where you don't know where to get started. You don't know how to get started. Even a set of steps helps. But then if you get derailed at all by any kind of early problem in the steps, then you fall away. And so it's got all the classic problems that come with ADD, I think. And I don't know how you break it down, but it's very, very similar.
Interesting. Randy asks, was being successful important to you, or did you have a goal that defined success?
Yeah, actually it was, I think. And I don't want to overthink it, but I think I got bullied a lot as a kid, and now it's a way of keeping score in a way, So
Yeah. You mentioned possibly having ADHD. How did you manage or cope with focusing on things you need to focus on but can't?
Well, as I said, I smoked for a long time, so stimulants helped. And when you don't have access to that, removing distractions is a big one. I find, I have trouble reading a book, but if I'm on an airplane, I can read a book. Why is that? Because there's not many other choices of things to do. So if you force the function by removing distractions and going to a place where you're not going to be constantly interrupted, And if you're 30 seconds into it, it's like, oh, I should get up and go check my, well, no, then you're still got trouble. But if you can at least keep yourself focused by removing distractions and keeping yourself to one task at a time, I think helps a lot too.
Which do you prefer, digging a hole or throwing a rock?
Digging a hole.
Sounds good. Tim writes, what kind of tips do you have for someone who might be on the spectrum in roles of management, managing diverse groups of folks? How did you persevere, for lack of a better word?
I made a lot of mistakes and I had some forgiving employees. That helped. And the biggest thing, as I said earlier, was figuring out the different styles of management that people individually need. But my biggest thing as a manager was that I did not delegate enough. So I always had this thing where I knew how I wanted it done. And I would either do it myself or tell the people to do it, roughly this way. And what you really want to do is find people that are talented and qualified and just say, this is what we need done. Go figure out how to do it for me, please. And let them run with it, because it took me a while to figure that out. But early in my management career, especially, I was very much a hands-on meta programmer where I would be very focused on this is how we're going to do it. And, with their input and help. But now I'm much more hands-off. And that was a hard transition for me, especially I think it is for anybody with ASD that's really got hyper focus and pays a lot of attention and has poor central coherence, because all you worry about then are details. You forget the big picture. Somebody that's neurotypical as a manager will have a much easier time, I think, looking at the big corporate objective or the big overall picture. That's something I've always struggled with.
Mm-hmm. Luann asks, what's something a neurotypical person can do to connect with someone on the spectrum when communication is failing?
Let me think. Ask really obvious questions that you wouldn't think to ask. Like, I don't want to say what is wrong, but specifically what is bothering you about this aspect. More importantly, what are you worried about is going to recur in the future? And what is it that you are trying to prevent or ensure? Because people with ASD get a lot of anxiety over change. They don't like change. They don't like unpredictability. They don't like lack of reliability. They don't like changes in schedules. All those things tend to throw us for a loop. And so anything you can do to avoid those things goes a long way, I think.
Rasmus says, hey, Dave, one of your Discord mods here, smiley face. As a developer, what do you value more? Experience, certifications, or education? Or maybe a mix?
Probably experience, I would say, because the experience probably implies some of the other. I mean, the education is important as well. Certifications, if you're looking for some specific skill set, then they're great. But if you're just looking for a generally smart programmer that can come in and be flexible and solve things in perhaps a couple of different languages and using different ways, it's hard to get a certification beyond a CS degree for that. So that's in a case where I look to person's past experience, and if they've been especially growing throughout a career path and growing in their complexity and in the scope of the work they're doing, that's always good too.
Oh. Sorry. How did you deal with bullying, and what advice would you give for kids and youth?
Run. No, I'm just kidding. I didn't deal well with it, especially. I did eventually let my parents know when there were especially problematic kids that I was actually scared of intense physical harm. And I would go to my parents a couple times and let them know, and they went to school and intervene in that sense. And that's something you, as a kid, you never want, right? You don't want your kids to have to, or your parents to get involved with school. It's embarrassing and it's difficult, but I'm glad that I did. And I would encourage other parents to not be afraid to get involved. You don't want to embarrass the kid, but protect the kid too, because kids on the spectrum are not able to protect themselves as well as other kids because they either lack the temperament or the ability sometimes to do so. So they need a little extra protection from parents in the school, I think.
How do you think you developed resilience through that?
As I grew older, I developed a real sense of who are they to me. And every time somebody would bother me, I would have to evaluate who is this person and how important is their opinion to me. And if it's, just a random bully, their opinion is really not important. They're just acting out or doing whatever they want. Whereas, a slight from somebody close to you would feel a lot different. So when it comes to strangers bullying you, eventually it's a strictly pragmatic thing of I'd like them to stop because it sucks, but it's not going to affect my personal value judgment anymore like it used to.
Do you feel like this happened mostly in childhood, or would you come into a scenario like that today?
Yeah, I think, well, my perspective probably started to shift as a teen, I would think. Once I started to gain a little more self-confidence, and the ability to defend myself too helped. And
what do you think brought that self-confidence as you got older?
expanded my friend groups, expanded my peer groups, got a girlfriend, did all kinds of things that other people were doing. And it made me feel a little more engaged in the community and normal and like the other kids.
Glenn asks, what are your thoughts on having gifted ASD kids grouped in a secondary school versus integrated?
I think grouping is good, but I like the pull-out ones where they do a couple hours a day or one day a week or something, which can be hard for the kids to be called out and identified that way. But I think the integration into the school is actually really important, because the socialization and everything else is something that you really can't do without. But then being able to hang out with a bunch of peers that are interested in stuff that you're interested in and allow you to show enthusiasm and stuff, and not be called a loser or an idiot for being, stoked about electronics or whatever it is you're into, is great. So that's why I think the gifted programs are good as well. So it's nice to have both.
How do you think that you became the confident person you are today?
I'll give my wife most of the credit for that, I think.
There you go. All right. Well, does anyone have any questions before we wrap up here? Does anyone want to get their questions in for Dave in these last couple minutes here? All right. Well, I think that's everything for me. Is there
Okay.
anything else that, Colleen, do I need to hand it back to you? Yes.
All right.
There we
Wow. Well, that was a quick hour. But I guess all good things need to come to an end. I'd like to say a special thanks to Michael Shires from the Dr. John Archer Library and Archives, and Luann Drake from Advancement in Communications for actually organizing this event. And I would like to say a huge thanks to Dave Plummer for taking the time to speak about his book and for helping to raise awareness about autism. Dave, you made the evening a lot of fun with your casual, no nonsense manner. And it is definitely a brave thing to come out and share what you have learned about yourself. And I believe everyone here tonight is richer for your doing so. I was reminded that we never know what lies behind someone's facade, and that we always need to look beyond and deeper. So thank you once again for taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.